Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. It's often described as one of the most recession-resistant businesses that exists because it sells the one thing every single human being eventually needs, guaranteed, with demand that never depends on the economy, the season, or a marketing campaign. Banks treat funeral homes as some of the safest loans in small business lending for exactly that reason. On paper, it looks close to unkillable. Here's what that guaranteed demand doesn't guarantee. In 2023, investigators in a small Colorado town found 190 decomposing bodies improperly stored inside a funeral home that had been taking payment from grieving families the entire time, some of those bodies dating back years. The owners weren't struggling to find customers, demand was never their problem. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what actually breaks in this business, and it's almost never a shortage of people walking through the door. That gap between guaranteed demand and genuine financial safety runs through this entire industry, from the smallest single-location family business all the way up to the largest death care company in the world, which has been forced by federal regulators to sell off pieces of itself 3 separate times in the last 2 decades simply for growing too dominant in too many local markets at once. Same guaranteed demand at every size, wildly different risks depending on how the business underneath that demand actually gets run. People think a funeral home is a service business built around comfort and tradition, where families come in, choose what feels right, and pay for a dignified goodbye. In reality, it's a retail and merchandise business operating on some of the highest markups in consumer commerce, sold almost entirely to customers who are grieving, exhausted, time-pressed, and have no real ability or appetite to comparison shop. That's not a moral judgment on the people who run these businesses. It's a structural fact about the customer's position at the exact moment they're buying, and understanding that fact explains almost every number in this video, from how caskets get priced to why the industry has consolidated the way it has. An independent, family-owned funeral home is still the backbone of this industry. Out of roughly 19,000 funeral homes in the United States, close to 90% remain independently owned, often passed down within the same family for generations, trading on decades of local trust that took a very long time to build and can't simply be purchased. A corporate-owned location, operating under a recognizable public-facing brand name that often doesn't reveal its actual corporate parent, is part of a much larger consolidated chain. Standardized pricing systems, shared purchasing power for merchandise, and centralized management replacing what used to be a single family's decisions. Research comparing pricing across the industry has consistently found these locations charging more than independents for comparable services. Largely because the brand recognition and consistency they offer commands a premium families are often willing to pay without realizing they're paying it. A combination operator runs a funeral home and a cemetery together, capturing revenue at every stage of the process instead of handing the family off to a separate cemetery business once the funeral service itself is done. And a direct cremation provider skips almost the entire traditional model. No viewing room, no hearse fleet, sometimes no physical chapel at all, competing purely on the lowest possible price for the simplest possible disposition, a category that's grown rapidly as cremation itself has become the majority choice nationally. This video mostly follows the traditional single-location funeral home because it's the version most new owners are actually evaluating, and it's where the tension between guaranteed demand and genuinely thin margins is easiest to see clearly. There's a fifth path worth naming too, since it's how a meaningful share of new owners actually enter this industry, buying an existing, already licensed funeral home outright rather than building one from the ground up. An established location comes with an existing customer relationship base, a trained staff already holding the required licenses, and a call volume history a lender can actually underwrite against, all of which meaningfully de-risks the purchase compared to opening cold in an unfamiliar community where trust hasn't been built yet. It also typically costs more upfront than building a bare-bones facility from scratch, since the buyer is paying for goodwill and an established reputation on top of the physical assets. Goodwill that, unlike a building or a hearse, doesn't show up as a hard asset on a balance sheet, but is very often the single most valuable thing changing hands in the transaction. Total startup costs for a new funeral home typically run from $750,000 to $2.5 million, depending heavily on location, building size, and how much of the operation you're building from scratch versus buying already established. Property alone, whether purchased or built out to code, commonly runs $250,000 to $1 million or more. Specialized equipment, embalming tables, refrigeration units built to hold multiple bodies at controlled temperature, and preparation room infrastructure typically adds another $50,000 to $200,000. None of it optional, all of it regulated by state health and licensing boards. Initial casket and merchandise inventory alone can run $30,000 to $100,000 before the doors even open, since families expect to see and choose from real product on a showroom floor, not a catalog. On top of the building and equipment, most states require a licensed funeral director and a licensed embalmer on staff, credentials that take years of mortuary science education and apprenticeship to earn, which means labor costs start accruing before the business generates its first dollar of revenue. Most new funeral homes plan for 18 to 24 months to reach break-even, carrying $50,000 to $170,000 in working capital specifically to survive that runway, because unlike a retail store, you cannot simply advertise harder to generate more demand on a slow month. The calls come when they come. That licensing requirement isn't a minor bureaucratic detail either. Mortuary science programs typically run 2 to 4 years, followed by a supervised apprenticeship of a year or more before a state board will grant a full funeral director's or embalmer's license. And many states require separate, additional licensing to actually perform embalming versus simply directing a funeral. A new owner without those credentials personally has to hire someone who holds them immediately, since a funeral home legally cannot operate, take in remains, or handle a single call without a licensed professional in the building. That single staffing requirement is a large part of why this industry has stayed so fragmented for so long. It's genuinely difficult to scale a business where the core service can only legally be performed by a small, slow-to-train pool of licensed professionals in any given region. Since 1984, the Federal Trade Commission has required every funeral home in the country to hand over an itemized general price list to anyone who asks for one, in person or by phone, listing the cost of every individual service and product separately rather than bundling everything into one number. Families also have the legal right to buy a casket from a third party, a warehouse club, an online retailer, anywhere, and have it shipped directly to the funeral home, which cannot refuse the delivery or charge a handling fee for accepting it. That rule exists precisely because, left alone, this industry historically didn't disclose pricing clearly, and more than 60% of funeral homes still post little or no pricing information on their own websites even now, years after regulators began pushing to extend the in-person disclosure requirement online. The rule gives families real legal protection. It does very little to change the emotional reality that almost nobody, mid-grief, is going to price shop 3 separate funeral homes and cross-reference casket costs on a warehouse club's website before making a decision, which is exactly the gap the next section is built on. The rule itself came out of a broader federal investigation that found funeral directors routinely picking up and embalming bodies without family consent, requiring families to buy a casket even for a simple cremation that legally needs no casket at all, and generally failing to make prices available in any usable form before a family had already committed to a specific home. Decades later, regulators are still revisiting the rule, most recently examining whether it needs updating for an industry where families increasingly research funeral options online before ever walking into a building, precisely because the original 1984 rule only ever required in-person disclosure and never anticipated a world where the first interaction with a funeral home happens on a website instead of in a lobby. The first layer is the basic service fee, a flat, non-negotiable charge covering the funeral director's professional time, administrative work, and overhead, typically somewhere in the range of $1,500 to $3,500, charged regardless of what specific services or merchandise a family ultimately chooses. The second layer, and by far the most profitable, is merchandise, led by the casket. A funeral home commonly buys caskets wholesale for somewhere between $300 and $1,500, then sells them retail for $1,000 to $10,000 or more, a markup that regularly runs 200 to 500%. A basic metal casket costing the funeral home $800 wholesale might sell on the showroom floor for $2,500 to $3,400. Because most families have no idea what a casket actually costs before markup and are choosing one during one of the worst weeks of their life, that markup rarely gets questioned, let alone negotiated. The third layer is outer burial containers, the vaults and grave liners many cemeteries require to keep the ground from sinking as a casket deteriorates over time. A basic concrete liner might cost $300 to $500 wholesale and sell for $800 to $1,500, and upgraded vaults can run into the thousands. The fourth layer is pre-need sales, funerals paid for and planned years in advance of an actual death. Money collected this way is legally required to sit in a dedicated trust account or an insurance policy until it's actually needed, untouched by the funeral home's day-to-day cash flow. That legal requirement exists for an obvious reason, and it becomes the single most important structural detail in this entire video the moment a funeral home's regular cash flow gets tight enough that someone in charge starts looking at that trust account and wondering whether anyone would notice. Pre-need isn't a niche corner of this business either. Industry groups estimate the U.S. funeral services market at over $20 billion a year, serving close to 2.8 million families annually, and a meaningful share of that volume is now pre-arranged rather than purchased in the immediate aftermath of a death. For the funeral home, a healthy pre-need book functions almost like a subscription business layered on top of a transactional one. It locks in future revenue and future market share years ahead of when the service actually happens, smoothing out what would otherwise be an unpredictable, entirely reactive cash flow built around a number nobody can forecast. How many people in town are going to die this particular month? Monthly operating costs for an established funeral home typically run $20,000 to $60,000, and staffing dominates that number. A licensed funeral director commonly earns $4,000 to $8,000 a month, a licensed embalmer $3,500 to $6,500, plus administrative and support staff on top of that, all of it required regardless of how many calls came in that particular month. A funeral home can't run on part-time or seasonal labor the way a retail shop can staff up for a busy weekend, because state law requires licensed professionals on hand. Full stop, whether the month brings 4 services or 40. Facility costs run continuously too. A fleet of vehicles, typically a hearse and at least one family limousine, both of which need regular maintenance and eventually cost tens of thousands of dollars to replace. Climate control precise enough to safely hold human remains. Insurance covering both the physical property and the specific professional liability this business carries. And licensing renewal fees that vary by state but never simply go away. Call volume itself carries its own quiet unpredictability that most new owners underestimate. Deaths don't arrive on a smooth, even schedule. Winter months and colder climates typically see meaningfully higher call volume than summer, driven by respiratory illness and weather-related mortality among older populations, which means a funeral home's busiest, most cash-generative weeks are concentrated into a predictable but genuinely lumpy calendar, not spread evenly across 52 weeks the way a typical retail business's revenue might be. Staffing has to be sized for a real month, not an average one, since a facility that's short-staffed during a genuine cluster of calls and a bad flu season isn't just inconvenienced, it risks the exact kind of care lapses that show up later in this video. Here's the trend reshaping this entire industry's economics, and it's not really about competition at all. The national cremation rate has climbed past 60% and keeps rising, expected to reach somewhere around 64% by the end of this year. That shift matters enormously to the math in this video, because a traditional burial with a service, viewing, casket, and vault typically runs $7,000 to $10,000 in total spending, while a direct cremation, the simplest, lowest cost disposition option, often runs just $2,000 to $3,000. Layer that shift on top of an aging population that's producing more total deaths every year, and you get a genuinely strange result. Total industry revenue can grow even as the average revenue per individual funeral shrinks, because the mix of what families are choosing has moved decisively toward the cheapest end of the menu. A funeral home that built its staffing, facility, and cost structure around the traditional burial economics of a decade ago can find its call volume holding steady or even rising, while its actual revenue per call quietly erodes underneath it year after year without a single dramatic event marking the moment things changed. This is also exactly why direct cremation providers, the leanest version of this business, have grown so quickly. They built their entire cost structure, minimal facility, no viewing room, no vehicle fleet beyond a basic transport van, around exactly the disposition method families are increasingly choosing anyway, while traditional full-service homes are left carrying a chapel, a hearse fleet, and a showroom built for a casket sale that a growing share of their own calls will never actually include. The average single-location funeral home generates somewhere around $1,090,000 a year in total revenue, typically corresponding to 113 to 200 calls annually, depending on the size and density of the local market. Net margins across the industry typically land somewhere between 10 and 15%, with the strongest operators reaching closer to 20%. Numbers that sound healthy until you remember they're being generated off a business that took $750,000 to $2.5 million just to open. Walk the arithmetic through on a 150-call year. If the average family spends $7,000 across the basic service fee, merchandise, and outer burial container, that's just over $1 million in gross revenue. Subtract $20,000 to $60,000 a month in operating costs, call it $480,000 for the year at the middle of that range, and the funeral home nets somewhere in the low hundreds of thousands before debt service on the original investment. Shift that same 150 calls toward a higher cremation mix. Average spending per family closer to $4,000 instead of $7,000, and gross revenue drops to $600,000 against nearly the same fixed cost base, since staffing and facility costs don't shrink just because families are choosing cheaper dispositions. The margin compresses hard on the exact same call volume, the exact same licensed staff, and the exact same building. Say it as a formula the way an owner would actually calculate it. Take expected annual call volume, multiply by average revenue per call, and that's gross revenue for the year. Subtract fixed costs, licensed staff salaries, facility overhead, insurance, and vehicle upkeep, all of which barely move regardless of volume, and what's left is operating profit before debt service. The entire multi-year arc of this industry, rising cremation adoption slowly dragging down that middle variable, average revenue per call, while the fixed cost side of the formula stays essentially locked in place, is the whole story of why margins have compressed industry-wide, even as the underlying number of deaths in the country continues to climb every single year. Here's what real consolidation looks like at the top of this industry. One company has grown into the largest death care operator in the world, running more than 2,500 funeral homes, over 460 cemeteries, and more than 150 crematoria across North America and parts of Europe, built almost entirely through decades of acquiring formerly independent family-run funeral homes and folding them into shared regional clusters that pool staff and equipment across multiple locations at once. That scale has repeatedly triggered antitrust action. When the company tried to acquire its second-largest competitor in 2006, federal regulators found the combined company would dominate funeral or cemetery services in dozens of local markets simultaneously, and forced it to sell off funeral homes in 29 separate markets and cemeteries and 12 more before the deal could close. A later attempt to acquire a different competitor in a $1.4 billion deal ran into the same wall, regulators requiring the divestiture of 53 funeral homes and 38 cemeteries to preserve local competition. A third acquisition required selling off 22 more funeral homes across 19 markets. 3 separate times in 3 separate deals, the same basic pattern played out. Buy up enough of a local market, and antitrust regulators force you to sell part of what you just bought, because too much consolidation in a business this emotionally captive raises real concerns about pricing power over families with essentially no leverage to negotiate. The brand names attached to these acquisitions rarely announce the ownership change to the public either, which is itself worth understanding as its own small structural detail. A family-owned funeral home acquired by a large consolidator commonly keeps operating under the exact same local family name on the sign outside, the same staff greeting families at the door, while the pricing structure, purchasing decisions, and profit ultimately route up to a corporate parent the family walking in the door has likely never heard of. That's not illegal or even necessarily deceptive in most states, but it does mean the decades of trust a family associates with a familiar local name doesn't always tell them who they're actually doing business with anymore. Now look at what happens at the opposite end of the scale, when a small, independent operation runs out of both money and integrity at the same time. A funeral home in a small Colorado town collected payment from grieving families for years, sometimes including pre-need money that should have been sitting untouched in trust, while its owners fell behind on properly handling the remains in their care. When investigators finally responded to reports of a foul odor coming from the building in 2023, they found 190 bodies stored improperly inside, some with dates of death stretching back years. The same investigation found the owners had misused more than $880,000 in pandemic-era small business relief funds, along with family payments, to buy a luxury SUV and sedan worth over $120,000 combined, cosmetic body sculpting procedures, vacations, roughly $31,000 in cryptocurrency, and luxury goods from brands like Gucci and Tiffany. Both owners eventually pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud conspiracy charges, facing years in federal prison. This wasn't an isolated pattern either. A separate funeral home owner in Massachusetts was found to have embezzled more than $375,000 from roughly 70 families who had paid in advance for pre-need funerals, money that state regulators require to sit in a dedicated trust account specifically so it can't be touched for anything else. He was ordered to pay back nearly $500,000 in restitution and penalties and permanently barred from the funeral industry after investigators found bodies in his care left improperly stored and unembalmed for months at a time. Put these cases next to each other and the lesson sharpens considerably. At the top of the industry, the risk is regulatory. Grow through acquisition fast enough, and antitrust authorities will eventually make you give part of it back. At the bottom, the risk is far darker. A business built on money collected from people who have no ability to walk away or shop around creates a genuine temptation for an operator whose cash flow has quietly gone underwater, and the trust account sitting there, legally protected but not always physically separated from everything else, becomes exactly the kind of unwatched pool of money that turns a struggling small business into a federal fraud case. What makes the smaller scale failures particularly hard to catch in advance is that state oversight of individual funeral homes is often thin and reactive rather than proactive. Licensing boards in many states inspect facilities infrequently, sometimes only in response to a specific complaint, which means a funeral home quietly falling behind on properly handling remains or maintaining its trust obligations can operate for months or years before anyone outside the building notices anything is wrong. The families paying that funeral home in the meantime have no realistic way to check, since the entire relationship is built on the assumption that a licensed professional is, by definition, handling things correctly behind a door they will never personally open. Put a full year on a single, independently owned funeral home, starting with the version where things go according to plan. In the optimistic scenario, the funeral home sits in a stable community with a healthy mix of traditional burials and cremations, has built genuine multi-generational trust with local families, and runs a disciplined pre-need program that keeps a predictable stream of future business locked in years ahead. All of it sitting properly in trust exactly where it's supposed to be. Call volume lands around $150 to $200 a year. Average family spending holds in the $6,000 to $7,000 range because the traditional service mix hasn't eroded too far toward the cheapest cremation option, and disciplined cost control keeps staffing and facility expenses in line with revenue. Net margin lands at the strong end of the industry range, somewhere near 20%, and the owner walks away with a genuinely comfortable six-figure income, on top of a business that, in this industry, rarely loses its customer base to a recession the way most small businesses do. That stability compounds in a way few other small businesses ever get to experience. A funeral home that earns real trust over a decade or two doesn't just retain existing families, it becomes the default choice referred to newcomers in the community almost automatically, since funeral selection overwhelmingly happens through word of mouth and prior family history rather than active shopping. That referral engine, once established, is close to impossible for a new competitor to replicate quickly at any price, which is exactly why a well-run independent home with decades of local goodwill can hold market share against a much better funded corporate entrant simply by continuing to do right by the families already coming through the door. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 ordinary things shifted once. Nothing scandalous, just the normal drift this entire industry is experiencing right now. The local cremation rate climbs a few points, pulling average revenue per call down from $7,000 toward $5,000. A new corporate branded competitor opens nearby with a national marketing budget and standardized pricing the independent home can't easily match on visibility, even if the actual service quality is comparable. And one of the 2 required license positions, the embalmer or the funeral director, needs replacing, a process that in a tight licensing market can take months and forces the owner to lean on costly temporary coverage in the meantime. None of these pressures individually would sink a well-capitalized funeral home. Stacked together on a fixed cost base of licensed staff and a facility that doesn't shrink just because the average sale got smaller, they can turn a comfortable 6-figure year into a thin one, the kind that's still technically profitable while barely clearing debt service on the original investment. That thinner year is precisely the environment where the darker outcome from the last section becomes more plausible, not less. An owner watching margin compress for 2 or 3 consecutive years, still legally obligated to fund a hearse replacement, still carrying the same licensed payroll, still making payments on the original construction loan, faces a genuinely difficult set of choices long before anything resembling fraud enters the picture. Most owners in that position cut marketing, defer non-essential maintenance, or take on additional debt to bridge the gap. The distinction between an honest business working through a hard stretch and one drifting toward the kind of collapse described earlier in this video is rarely a single decision. It's usually a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each individually defensible, that eventually reaches a point where the money owed to families no longer matches the money actually available to give it back. That's the gap this business runs on, somewhere between a genuinely stable, recession-resistant income and a quietly thinning margin on the exact same call volume, the exact same license, and the exact same building. And the deciding factor was almost never whether people kept dying. It's whether the mix of what they were dying into, burial or cremation, and the trust an operator maintained with the community and with the money families handed over in advance held up over years, not just over any single difficult month. So this was never really a story about caskets or grief or which funeral home in town families trust most. It was a story about what happens when a business is built on customers who, by definition, cannot walk away, comparison shop, or negotiate, and what that captive position tempts an operator to do when the numbers stop working the way they used to. None of the formats in this video are doomed, and none of them are guaranteed. A well-run, honestly operated funeral home, independent or corporate, can generate one of the most stable income streams available to a small business owner in America, precisely because the demand underneath it never actually goes away. A funeral home that lets its cost structure fall out of step with a shifting cremation market, or lets cash flow pressure turn a legally protected trust account into a source of quiet, temporary relief, can end up on the wrong side of a federal indictment regardless of how many families still trusted enough to walk through the door. What separates the two was never how many people needed the service. It's whether the business and the person running it stayed honest about the gap between the money that had already been spent and the money that was still owed to families who had no idea anything was wrong. The operators who make this work across generations tend to describe it the same way, whether they're running one location or overseeing a regional cluster. The guaranteed demand is real, but it was never actually the hard part of the business. The hard part is holding a level of trust that a family only ever has to extend once, during the single worst week of their life, with no ability to take it back if that trust turns out to have been misplaced. If you had $2 million to put into this industry, would you rather build one traditional full-service funeral home or open several lean, direct cremation-only locations instead? Tell me in the comments. If this laid out numbers you'd never actually seen broken down before, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you want the same breakdown for another business people think they understand, subscribe. Every week, one more business that looks simpler from the outside than it actually is.